Welcome back, fellow mages, to the Grounded Mage, where we explore how myth and magic exist in everyday life. I apologize in advance. I am fighting the worst cold this week, so probably going to struggle a little with this week's episode, but here we go. Today, we dive into one of my favorite rivalries in the comic book world, Tony Stark and Steve Rogers. Now, let's be honest. If Iron Man and Captain America were in therapy, that poor therapist would never get a word in. Tony would be trying to hack the computer to look at his own notes, and Steve would be apologizing for being 5 minutes early. But here's the thing. Their conflict isn't just entertainment. It's us. Every one of us has a little Iron Man or a little Captain America inside our hearts. One part wants recognition, success, and control. The other just wants to do the right thing, even if no one notices. Today, we're diving into the psychological tug-of-war between ego and integrity, how it plays out in the Marvel Universe, and more importantly, how it plays out inside you. Because maybe your inner Tony Stark isn't building suits of armor. Maybe he's building emotional walls. So let's get into it. Let's start with Tony Stark, the human embodiment of, look at me, I fixed it. He's a genius, billionaire philanthropist, and deeply insecure. If Tony had a mantra, it would probably be, if I can't control it, I'll just outsmart it. Psychologically speaking, Tony's what Carl Jung might call an inflated ego archetype, over-identifying with his intellect and achievements as a defense against deeper feelings of inadequacy. When we feel powerless or insecure, we compensate by overachieving, overanalyzing, or overcontrolling. For Tony, that means endless tinkering and innovation. For the rest of us, it might look like trying to fix everything, the project, the relationship, even ourselves. And who could blame Tony? He grew up with a distant, critical father. Howard Stark valued brilliance, not vulnerability. So Tony learned early on that love is conditional. It's something that had to be earned. When he becomes Iron Man, it's not just a superhero origin story. It's a trauma response. The armor literally represents protection from his own shame and guilt. He hides behind technology the way we hide behind busyness and bravado. Think about it. How often do we all wear our own invisible suits of armor? We armor up with productivity, perfectionism, humor, even spiritual wisdom sometimes, all in the name of protection. In psychology, there's a term called ego idealization. It's when we create an image of who we think we should be, perfect, competent, lovable, and then we chase it relentlessly. Tony's image? Genius, savior, always in control. But that image starts cracking after the Avengers when he faces real fear, not of failure, but of being helpless. Remember in Iron Man 3 when his whole identity starts to crumble after the Avengers? Panic attacks, insomnia, an obsession with building more suits? That's not just plot. It's textbook ego overcompensation. There's even a psychological term for this, narcissistic defense. It's when someone's self-worth depends entirely on maintaining an image of superiority. It's exhausting, but it feels safer than vulnerability. We all have shades of this. When you stay late at work just to prove you're on top of things, or you post something online hoping for validation that you're doing okay, that's your inner Tony Stark, tinkering away in the workshop of self-worth. But underneath Tony's arrogance is something profoundly human. The desire to be enough. He's not driven by greed or vanity. He's driven by a desperate need for worth. That's why his transformation matters. The panic attack that sticks out to me is when a child asks him about New York. He can't breathe in this moment. This is the moment that his ego loses control and his unhealed self surfaces. Psychologically, panic is the ego's alarm bell. I can't maintain the illusion anymore. And that illusion of total control, of being the hero who never falters, is really heavy to carry. By endgame, Tony's ego has matured. He's not trying to prove he's Iron Man. He simply is. He builds the world a future, not a monument. And in the end, he lays down the armor willingly. That's the moment the ego surrenders to the soul. What's your armor made of? Is it perfectionism, humor, productivity? And when do you find yourself building armor instead of boundaries? Now, let's talk about Captain America, the human embodiment of a moral compass wrapped in muscle and polite disapproval. Steve Rogers was good before he was great. Even before the serum, he was the guy standing up to bullies in alleyways with nothing but a trash can lid and moral conviction. Psychologists call this a strong internal locus of control, the belief that your actions, not your circumstances, determine your worth. It's what gives Steve his unwavering sense of integrity. But there's a fine line between integrity and idealism, and Steve walks it like a tightrope. Captain America also embodies what psychologists call moral identity, the degree to which being a good person is central to who you are. In studies, people with strong moral identities tend to act more ethically and are more generous. But here's the twist. They also struggle when reality challenges their ideals. They can burn out and they can become rigid. Sound familiar to you? Steve Rogers lives by his internal compass. But what happens when that compass points him in a direction no one else believes in? That's civil war. That's the moment integrity turns into isolation. We see it in ourselves too. We cling so tightly to doing the right thing that we can't hear anyone else's perspective. When integrity becomes identity, we risk moral superiority. It's the psychological phenomenon known as moral rigidity. In Captain America, the Winter Soldier, when he realizes S.H.I.E.L.D. is corrupted from the inside, he refuses to compromise. He tears it all down because the price of freedom is high. That's integrity, but it's also a kind of moral absolutism, the belief that right and wrong are always clear-cut. Psychologically, this kind of black and white thinking is comforting. It gives us certainty, identity, and purpose. But in reality, it can isolate us. When we define ourselves purely as being the good one, we can end up rejecting parts of ourselves that are messy, selfish, or human. That's what Carl Jung would call the shadow self, the parts we disown in the name of being good. And Steve's shadow shows up in Civil War. He refuses to sign the Sokovia Accords because he doesn't trust oversight, even when it costs him friendships, loyalty, and home. He's not wrong. He's just rigid. And that's where integrity, when overextended, can become isolation. Now, contrast that with Endgame. Steve finally allows himself to choose something for himself. Spoilers if you've been living under a rock. He goes back in time and stays with Peggy, not out of duty, but desire. That's not selfish. It's self-integrated. He finally accepts that doing the right thing also includes caring for his own happiness. And that's what psychologists call moral maturity, the ability to balance ethical principles with compassion for human imperfection. For many of us, that's a challenge too. We want to be good, kind, fair, consistent, but life keeps testing what good even means. Do you tell the truth if it hurts someone? Do you keep your promise if it costs you your peace? Captain America forces us to ask, where's the line between integrity and rigidity? And maybe, more importantly, can you forgive yourself when you cross it? When was the last time your inner Captain America stood so firmly in principle that it cost you a connection? Was it worth it? All right, so we've got Iron Man's ego, all fire, invention, and bravado, and Captain America's integrity, all heart, duty, and moral compass. But the real showdown, that's not on a tarmac in Berlin. It's happening inside us. Because whether we realize it or not, we all live our own civil war. Think about it. Part of you wants to win, to push, to prove, to succeed. That's your inner Tony Stark, building, optimizing, and striving. The other part of you wants to do right, to stay honest, grounded, and kind. That's your inner Steve Rogers standing tall, even when no one's watching. And some days, they're best friends. Your ambition fuels your purpose, your confidence supports your values, everything is in harmony. But other days, they are punching each other through emotional buildings. Like when you're offered a promotion at work that conflicts with your mental health, Tony says, "You earned this. Take it." Steve asks, "At what cost?" Or when you post something online that gets attention and suddenly you're wondering, am I sharing this to help people or to get validation? Yeah, civil war. Psychologically, this inner conflict maps perfectly onto something called self-discrepancy theory, developed by Ettore Higgins. It says we have three selves: the actual self, who we are right now in all our messy glory; the ideal self, who we want to be, our ambitious, shining Tony Stark side; and the ought self, who we should be according to our morals, family, culture, or Captain America level conscience. Now, the problem isn't having all three. We need them. The problem is when they drift too far apart. When your actual self doesn't measure up to your ideal self, you feel disappointment and frustration. When your actual self doesn't live up to your ought self, you feel guilt and shame. And if you're juggling both, welcome to the full-blown civil war of the psyche. Ever felt like no matter how much you achieve, it's never enough? That's Tony's side overpowering you. Or maybe you feel paralyzed, constantly trying to make the right choice, afraid of being selfish. That's Steve's side calling the shots. Neither one is wrong. They're just incomplete without each other. Here's a relatable example. Let's say you're a parent who's also pursuing a creative dream. Your ego says, you have something to say, something important, so don't give up. Your integrity says, but your kids need you. Be responsible. And suddenly, every decision feels like you're betraying someone. That's not failure. That's the tension of being human. We need ego. It gives us vision, drive, and the courage to evolve. And we need integrity. It keeps that power in check, reminding us why we started. Too much Tony, and we burn out chasing approval. Too much Steve, we fade out trying to please everyone. It's like driving a car with two pedals. Ego is the gas, integrity is the brake. Use one too much, you crash or you stall. But when you learn how to balance them, you move forward with control and purpose. In Jungian psychology, this balance is part of individuation, the process of integrating all the parts of yourself into harmony. You stop identifying with just one archetype, the achiever, the saint, the savior, and instead you become whole. And maybe that's the real message of civil war. It wasn't about who was right. It was about what happens when two valid truths stop listening to each other. The same thing happens inside us. Where do you feel that tug of war most in your life? Between your drive to succeed and your desire to stay authentic? And what would it take for those two parts to finally stop fighting and start collaborating? Now, before we drag Tony Stark's ego through the mud, let's pause for a second, because the ego is not the villain here. We've turned ego into a dirty word in modern spirituality and self-help. It's like the monster we're supposed to destroy. You've probably heard people say, you've got to kill your ego. But do you know who says that? Usually someone whose ego just found a clever way to feel superior being ego-free. Psychology tells a different story. According to Carl Jung, the ego isn't something to eliminate. It's something to integrate. It's your sense of self, the I that navigates the world. Without an ego, you can't set boundaries or take pride in your work or even say no. Tony Stark's journey actually shows this evolution. Early on, his ego is inflated. It's all external validation, achievements, power. He's not using his ego. He's being used by it. But as the films go on, his ego matures. It starts serving something bigger than itself. Remember that moment in Endgame where he figures out time travel? The old Tony would have shouted it from the rooftops. But this Tony quietly builds what's needed because the goal isn't glory, it's growth. That's what psychologists call ego strength. It's not arrogance, it's stability. It's the ability to hold your identity steady even when the world doesn't applaud you. Healthy ego is what lets you say, I matter, and so do you. It's what turns confidence into contribution. So maybe it's not about killing the ego at all. It's about training it, like Tony trains his AI. When your ego works for your heart instead of against it, you stop performing for approval and start creating for authenticity. What would your life look like if your ego worked for your purpose instead of trying to prove it? And then there's Steve Rogers, our gold standard of goodness, the man who literally says, I can do this all day. And you just know his therapist eye twitches every time he says it. Steve's defining trait is integrity, his unshakable belief in doing what's right. But that same integrity can become a trap when it hardens into perfectionism. Psychologically, that's what we call moral rigidity, the tendency to cling so tightly to being good that we lose sight of being human. Think about civil war again. Steve refuses to compromise his principles when compromise could prevent conflict. That's not ego, that's attachment to moral identity. It's the belief that if we bend even once, we'll break who we are. But here's the thing. Flexibility is not weakness. In fact, research in moral psychology shows that adaptive moral reasoning, the ability to shift perspectives, is linked with greater empathy, better relationships, and less burnout. And by the end of his story, Steve learns this. When he chooses to go back and live a quiet life with Peggy, he's not abandoning his principles. He's expanding them. He's realizing that doing what's right for him is also valid. That's the shift from moral absolutism to moral maturity. From I must always do the right thing to I can choose what's right in this moment. For us, that might look like this. You don't have to answer every late night text to prove that you care. You don't have to sacrifice your rest to feel worthy. Integrity doesn't mean saying yes to everything good. It means saying no to what's not aligned. Where are you confusing being good with being selfless? And what if being true to yourself is the most honest form of integrity? So now we know ego isn't the enemy and integrity isn't about perfectionism. But how do we actually balance them? How do we stop living in civil war and start living in endgame? Let's ground this in something practical. Here are a few ways to help your inner Tony and your inner Steve finally get on the same team. Number 1, check your motives, not your mask. Ask yourself, why am I doing this? If it's to prove, impress, or control, that's ego running the show. If it's to connect, serve, or express, that's integrity guiding it. And sometimes it's a bit of both, and that's okay. Awareness is balance. 2, celebrate healthy pride. There is nothing wrong with being proud of yourself. In fact, pride is one of the most misunderstood emotions. Psychologists identify authentic pride as the key driver of growth. It's the satisfaction that comes from effort, not ego. When you acknowledge your progress, you feed your self-worth instead of your self-doubt. So the next time you do something well, don't downplay it. Channel your inner Tony and say, yes, I did that. Because humility isn't hiding your light. It's letting it shine without burning anyone. 3, loosen your moral armor. Ask yourself where your goodness might actually be keeping you small. Are you afraid to set boundaries because you don't want to disappoint anyone? Are you overcorrecting to be the bigger person? That's integrity turning into self-erasure. True goodness has flexibility. It bends without breaking. Sometimes compassion means saying no. Sometimes integrity means resting instead of rescuing. 4, integrate the two energies. Here's the secret. Ego gives you drive, and integrity gives you direction. You need both to move forward without crashing. When they work together, your life starts to feel aligned, ambitious but peaceful. You stop chasing and you start creating. So instead of asking, which one am I more like, Iron Man or Captain America? Ask, what would my life look like if both of them worked on the same project? Because that's the real integration. When your confidence serves your conscience and your conscience empowers your confidence. That's wholeness. That's growth. And maybe that's what becoming a hero really means. What's one small way you could let your ambition and integrity collaborate this week instead of compete? In the end, we're all just trying to build our own suit of armor, one that protects but doesn't imprison us. And maybe the real superpower isn't choosing ego or integrity, it's learning how to integrate both. Because the best version of you is not Iron Man or Captain America. It's whoever you become when your heart and drive are on the same team. So, whose voice is louder in you right now? Tony's or Steve's? And what would happen if you let them talk instead of fight? Thanks for listening. If this episode resonated with you, share it with someone who's also trying to balance drive and integrity. Don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories that help you see your own magic a little more clearly. Until next week, make it make magic.